So, our next speaker has a big experience to high performance. He was also a CPO for the Olympic Game at the Olympic Games in Rio 2016, and he's also a VP of the VP of the Association of Chartered Physiotherapists in Sport and Exercise Medicine in the UK, and he is currently the head of physiotherapy and rehab at the Irish Rugby Football Union. Please welcome to the stage, Phil Glasgow.
Good morning, everyone. It's so good to be here, and it's great to be back here. I was chatting with Mario over the last number of months in preparation for today, and just even reflecting. I can't believe it's 10 years since I was here for the first time. I remember having a fantastic time, and then again in 2015 for the World Congress, and so I feel hugely honoured then to be here on this 20th anniversary, and it's my third time at this conference. And today I want to talk about muscle injury. I'm going to try and make it highly practical, share some lessons that hopefully you can apply to your context, lessons that we've tried to apply within the sport of rugby, which I know isn't particularly huge here in Switzerland, but I think you can take the principles and apply them to your sport. And I'll be really interested to hear some of your thoughts. And so I work for the Irish Rugby Football Union. That is the national governing body for rugby in Ireland, and we have four provinces of Connaught, Leinster, Munster and Ulster. And those four provinces are the professional teams, our high-performance system, which then members from those provinces form our national team. And we have a very important game tomorrow evening that I'll be back for against the world champions, South Africa, in Dublin. And so one good thing about our system is that it's a centralised system. All of our professional athletes within these four provinces are contracted to the national governing body. All of their medical records, all of their GPS, all of the system, if you like, is centralised to the Irish rugby system. Okay, so that's quite a unique thing, and so that we can pull together the data of the four provincial teams plus all of the national teams to help inform our decision making and help then to roll out an approach that applies to the entire system and to all of these teams rather than just a single team approach. And so one of the things that we did, so rugby's a combative sport. It's big, strong, physical guys. And one of the things that we did, or I did whenever I joined Irish Rugby a few years ago, was to ban the term injury prevention. We don't talk about injury prevention. We don't allow anyone to talk about injury prevention because players don't care about injury prevention. And coaches definitely don't care about injury prevention. So in a sport like rugby, we say, you can't talk about injury prevention, but what we can do is we can build robustness. We want to make really robust players. We want you to be robust, and robustness we define as the capacity to consistently engage in training and games with maximal effort. Every coach, every player goes, yeah, sign me up for that. Yeah, injury prevention, no thanks. Okay, so we have our robustness project and our robustness program, and I want to share with you that within the context of muscle injury this morning. And so when we think about robustness, you know all this, but just we recognise there are many factors that are non-modifiable, such as age and gender and potentially previous injury. There are lots of other factors that we put under the well-being component, and we have well-being monitoring every day with our players, looking at their sleep quality, their stress, and we look at psychological measures with our clinical psychologist, as well as some of these other factors that you can see. Obviously, there's all of the factors around load, and I'll touch on some of the load thing, and load's been a bit of a contentious issue, if you like, over the last few years, but I think it's gotten overcomplicated, like most of these things are. But we can think of what's the acute load within a given week, what's the chronic load, where have you come from, what about the non-rugby and the non-sport-specific load, the game frequency, and also our training frequency, taking all of that into account, and then we look at the capacity, your ability to execute these tasks. So how well do you move? How well conditioned are you? Your quality of your speed and agility, strength and power, and the mobility, stability, if you like. So putting all of that together helps us to start to build in a systematic way really robust players. And so if we start to think then specifically around muscle, which is my topic to talk about today. What does the data tell us? Well, we know from Arnlug Wangenstein's work from when she was in Aspetar, looking at hamstring re-injury rates. The information tells us here that, well, just to orientate you to this graph first, this is the re-injury, cumulative proportion of re-injury, and this is the time after from return to sport until re-injury for hamstring injuries. And what you see here is that in only two of the people, they tended to get that a hamstring injury, but it was in a different muscle. For two of them, it was in the same muscle, but in a different location. But the overwhelming majority, 79%, when someone re-injured a hamstring muscle, it was in the same muscle and the same location. So it was a re-injury of the same index injury. And the interesting thing here is that within 25 days of return to sport, 50% of those re-injuries happen. So what does that tell us? A little bit like what Lynn has said about ACL time might be important. Okay, so the bit just after returning to sport seems to be the time when you're most at risk. So we want to pay attention. What's going on around that return to sport? How well prepared are we getting people to return to sport? And then when they're back playing again, is it all no holds barred, off you go, or do we have to put in certain measures or pay attention to certain things? So as we put this together, we start to build a little bit of a picture about how we can build player robustness. So I've got a question for you. If I asked you to say what key characteristics, if you were wanting to build robust players, I'm going to use the prevent word, and prevent or reduce the burden of muscle injuries, hamstring injuries in particular, what would they be? Okay. Just think about that. List, what are your top three? What physical characteristics do you think might be important? And I've put a few references at the bottom of the screen that might suggest some things that you might think of. But when you ask people this, generally what happens is most people say, well, they've got to get really eccentrically strong. Yeah, they talk about eccentric strength. Or they talk about sprinting's really important. Yeah, and some people might talk about neuromuscular control, they might talk about various other things, but I just want you to think in your mind, if you're building robust players and preventing either index or recurrent muscle injuries, what types of things might you want to look at? Well, we asked the same question, and I want to look at a few specific things that we've done for that. So the first thing, as I said, was, I've gone too far. So one of the things that we did for our robustness project, looking at all of our different injuries. So we looked at our injury incidence and prevalence across the sport, and we categorized all of the different injuries, and you're looking at the evidence, and we brought together the strength conditioning coaches, physios, medical staff, coaches together, and we pulled together a consensus on setting standards or robustness standards of what we wanted all players to be able to do. And so for our hamstring and groin, we were very clear to say, here are some of the things that we think most of our players should be able to do. So for example, I've pressed the wrong button again. We look at maybe our Nordboard scores. We want everyone to be sort of 450 to 500 newtons on a Nordboard. We expect people to be able to do 1.5 times body weight in a double leg RDL, for example. We expect everyone to run over 90% of their max velocity 2 to 3 times every 10 days. So we set some of these standards, and these are standards we expect everybody within our system to be able to meet. Those are our minimum standards. We have our aspirational standards, which are a layer above that, which I'm happy to share as well. So we expect everyone to do that, and we test that regularly. And so let's see if it actually makes a difference. That's the question, isn't it? So one of the things that we did was we took 251 players across a number of seasons, relatively equally distributed in terms of forwards and backs, and we measured their groin strength and their hamstring strength using Nordboard and a groin bar, as they used to call it now, force frame, throughout pre-season, mid-season, right through from the 2017 right through the 2020 seasons. And as you can see there, the rugby is a sport where you get really enormous guys, yeah, and some smaller guys. So there's a huge range in terms of playing position and morphology. But let's have a look at what we saw, and we then looked at that along with our injury data. Well, when we look at it, which is interesting, that if we look at the change in hamstring strength, so did their hamstring strength go up or down over time over that, and in terms of their sort of main eccentric hamstring strength between those people who were injured and uninjured, the thing that stood out for us was actually there was no obvious difference in hamstring eccentric strength between those people who were injured and those people who weren't injured. Okay. Oh, right. Well, we would be led to believe potentially that all you got to do to prevent hamstring injuries is just be strong eccentrically, but that's not what that information is telling us, yeah? And so then we also looked, remember, at our groin squeeze or our adductor strength. And so looking at a change in adductor strength at 60 degrees hip and knee flexion, as you saw in the picture from before, pre-injury to post-injury for those people who got injured, and then the change in eccentric hamstring strength, we found something really quite interesting here, was that actually people who got a hamstring injury, their hamstring strength, eccentric hamstring strength, tended to get better. So they worked really hard on their hamstrings, but guess what? Their groin or their adductor strength went down. And those people who had a reduction in their adductor strength and an increase in their hamstring strength were more likely to get injured. Yeah. Oh, okay. So now what we're thinking is that actually in our rehab, just for hamstrings, you've got to think about more than just hamstrings. That's, for me, the big takeaway. You've got to think about more than just one muscle. One exercise for just one muscle ain't going to fix it, yeah? Because no muscles work in isolation, and we have to think about how they interact with the rest of the system, yeah? So it's not just about getting one muscle strong to prevent our hamstring injuries. It's about looking at ensuring we put strength in the whole system, and all the muscles are working together. So that was the first thing, muscle strength, and I'm sure that was one of your top three, yeah? The other thing is that you've got to run fast. You've got to run really fast, and we know that sprinting is injurious or carries a reasonable amount of risk with it for hamstring injury, isn't that right? So we see it a lot in sprinters. So what's important about running fast, and then how do we do it? Well, I think one of the things, and this is just data that I pulled out of Dorn's great paper looking at lower limb muscle function at running at different speeds. And we have here on the left-hand side of the screen, iliopsoas, glute max, hamstrings, rec fem. And on the right-hand side, your vasti, and then your calf gastroc and soleus. But what do we see there? Well, we see really quickly this exponential, if you like, increase in hamstring force with increasing running speed. Yeah. So when we're running, when we're sprinting, we see a really significant increase in forces being generated through the hamstrings. Okay. So running fast is very demanding for hamstrings. Yeah. Interesting. This isn't a calf talk, but it's important one to note is that your calf works hard all the time. Yeah. So jogging, your calf works hard. So don't start with your calf rehab early doing long, slow jogs because your calves are working really hard. Yeah, you've got to think better than that. But you could potentially start early running really slow with hamstrings because they don't do much. Yeah. Okay, so we've got to understand that. But one of the key things is that hamstrings work really hard when you run fast. Yeah, that we know. And so what we did, and this is just some observation of an analysis from our data from, remember, we've got all of our players across all of our system, and we took actually a period of time looking at all of our players across the system, and we took a 30-day lead-up where there was no injury, okay, and so in both groups, and then we looked at those players who didn't get injured, and we looked at those players who did get injured, and said, is there any difference in what happened in the 30 days before they got injured? Okay, and those were people who didn't have a previous injury, what we call the clean analysis. Does that make sense? So what we saw was there was no significant effect or no relationship what we observed between the total distance that they'd run, the HMLD, which is high metabolic load distance, or meters per minute, the density of sessions. But what there was that those people who had a significant level, who had high levels of very high-speed running, tended not to get injured. Yeah. Okay. So those people who were consistently exposed to very high-speed running with no history of injury tended not to get injured, and those who weren't did get injured. Yeah, that makes sense. But then one of the things I said when I looked at this, well, there's so many players have so much injury history. So how many rugby players have no injury history? Not many. So it was a very small number. So let's look at the guys, what we called our covariate analysis. So we looked at those players who did or didn't have injury in the previous 30 days because you're doing really well as a rugby player if you can go 30 days without picking up some sort of injury. Yeah, most of them get something. So we thought, well, let's look at a real-world analysis. And actually, when we looked at that over the chronic load for those running variables, we found what you might expect, the same thing, except that if you had an injury, that also was an independent contributor or towards getting a subsequent injury. Okay, so having having not enough exposure to very high-speed running or previous injury were the two big things that stood out. So actually what that says is that very high-speed running actually is really important. To have an average chronic exposure to very high-speed running seems to give a protective effect against having a hamstring injury. Okay, so if you don't sprint very often, then you sprint, guess what? You're likely to get hurt. Yeah, or if you've had a previous injury, you're more likely to get injured. So one of the things that I talk about, I love mountaineering, and I even love the fact that I could look out the window of the hotel this morning and see some snow in the Alps. Fantastic. And anybody here, I'm almost embarrassed talking about in Switzerland, talking about alpinism, but you guys are way better than me, but I do love to climb. But we all know that when we're climbing high altitude mountains, the idea is that you climb high and sleep low, yeah, to facilitate acclimatization. So if you're climbing really high, 8,000 meter peaks or 7,000 meter peaks, you want to go and climb high and sleep low to facilitate adaptation. Well, within our sport, what we say is we climb high and sleep low. We train high and play low. Yeah, we train high and play low. So we're consistently exposed to high levels of training so that when we play, we have the cognitive bandwidth to be able to make decisions and respond to what's going on around us. Yeah, and so we have to be able to get comfortable living at altitude, because high performance sport, we play the world champions tomorrow. We're currently rated #1 in the world. If we want to stay there and win a World Cup next year, we've got to get comfortable living at altitude. And if you break when you go there, guess what? You don't deserve to live there. Yeah, that's our approach. Okay, that's high performance. And so what we try to do is build consistent exposure. And so with all of our GPS monitoring at various metrics, we want to get people consistently getting above what we refer to as our match fitness level, which is just an arbitrary sort of one. But when we look at all of the demands of someone in that position that they need to be able to do consistently over time, we set that is a match fitness level. And you need to be consistently above that level if you're going to climb high and sleep low. Yeah. And so you see an example here for very high speed running, where this group, this is a team, one of our 4 teams, was up here, but over the season they allowed things to drop. And how common that happens? You get into the middle of a season, you lurch from one game to another, and you take your eye off the ball and you stop doing your high-speed running and training, very high-speed running and training. And so we've worked hard to get them back up again. We see this other group who are chronically underloaded in terms of their very high-speed running. That's not good enough. So we monitor that, we pay attention to that, and we have conversations with coaches, with S&C coaches, and with the physiotherapists around making sure we change that. Because this is a player, this is one of our players who has each one of these red bars here is when they've been injured. And you can see that what we say in Ireland, or what we say in my part of Ireland anyway, is that his workload is up and down like a fiddler's elbow. Yeah, he's up and down. He lurches from injury, and then he comes back, gets big spikes and load, and then gets injured again. And we see this block of injury where his ability to do anything drops. Then he comes back, he spikes, gets injured again, spikes, gets injured again. And so this is what you want to avoid. And so we see over the last 3 seasons, this going into the COVID season, here were injuries, and look at this big spike, he gets injured again. Then he has some surgery, he comes back, he spikes, he gets injured again, he spikes, he gets injured again, he spikes, keeps going, and yep, oh no, gets injured, spikes, injured, spikes, injured, spikes, and it's a story, 60% availability. That's not robustness, okay? That's the opposite of robustness. So one of the key things I would say around preventing our muscle injuries is that consistency is key. It's really important to get consistent exposure to the critical velocities and to the volume of training that you need to do to be able to live at altitude. Consistency is key. You don't just pack it all in and expect to get away with it. You won't, particularly if you've got an injury history like this guy. So our goal with this guy at the minute is that, yeah, he's fit to play, if you like, at one level, but we're not letting him play because we want to get him comfortable living at altitude. Because if he plays tomorrow, I guarantee we've got 3 international games. We play South Africa tomorrow, Fiji next week, and Australia the week after. I guarantee by the 3rd game he's injured again if he plays. Yeah. But if we hold him back, hopefully we have him through 6 Nations and World Cup next year, because he's a really important player. But what does the data tell us? Well, looking at AFL from Western Australia, we see here in Aussie rules that actually getting enough, so 427 to 710 metres of sprint distance in rehab was protective against subsequent injury. So making sure you get enough sprinting in before returning to sport seems to be really important. And that actually all the big volume stuff didn't seem to be as important. Then if we look at Rod Whiteley and colleagues and some of the things they've looked at in professional footballers, that we see that often people, after they've had hamstrings and they return to sport, often their sprint distances and their very high-speed running distances are suppressed for a long period of time afterwards. You can see these were the levels of running beforehand, and you can see after returning to sport, they're often below the levels of what they were beforehand. And we were thinking about where you were before injury and after injury again. So what we see here is that if we're not exposing people to enough running in their rehab, and they're going back and they're consistently underloaded, is it any wonder that 50% is happening within the first 25 days? Yeah, so sprinting is really important. So give us some data on that, Phil, and just tell us what things might be important. Well, looking at our cohort, we've looked at 228 time loss hamstring injuries, okay? And we looked at their exponentially weighted moving averages around their chronic loads for those variables that you can see there, HMLD, very high speed running distance sprint, and those zone 5 and 6 accelerations. So that's the top end, really high speed accelerations. We took 28 days, we looked at the 28 days before they got injured. So the 4 weeks before injury, what were they doing in training? Then we looked at them, then they were injured, and we looked at them for the 120 days after they returned from training. Yeah? Okay? And so what did we see? Anything? Well, we looked at those people who had those 228 hamstring injuries, and after that, how many got any lower limb injury? Any lower limb injury at all. It could be a knee, an ankle, a calf, a hamstring, whatever. And we saw that 36 of them were injured in those first 30 days, 23 here, 33 in that 60 to 120 days. So 92 of them had some form of lower limb injury. But what we were really interested in was how many of them were re-injured and had subsequent hamstring injuries. Well, the first thing we see is we had a re-injury rate of 22. Which is about 10%, which is probably consistent with the literature, okay? But we see that 11 of those happened within those first 30 days, then 6 of them in the next 30 days, and then in the next 60 days we had 5. So you see that gradually dropping off over time. So the longer you can go without getting injured, the less likely you are to get injured. But that first 30 days seems to be highest risk, yeah? And so did we notice anything? So these are observations that we have. So they're purely an observational presentation that I'm providing for you here. So what we saw, which was really, I think is really interesting, is that those people who had time between restarting training and peak chronic load, okay? So basically, those people, how long it took them to get back to training again. What we see here is that those people who got there, those who re-injured versus those who didn't injury, those people who took 15 days rather than 12 days to get to very high-speed running distance tended not to get injured. Those who took an extra few days to build their sprint load tended not to get injured. Now, you might say, Phil, it's only a few days, but we're talking about people who are getting back to play within 18, 21 days here. Okay, so we're talking about a 3-week return to sport. We're talking about, do they play in that game, or perhaps we hold them back and they don't play in that game, so missing one game potentially. Then if we looked at when they returned to sport, did their chronic load return to at least 90% of their pre-injury levels? And this for me was really interesting. And so really what we're saying here is, here's for very high speed running, those who didn't re-injure, 64% of them had reached their 90% of their pre-injury chronic load, whereas only 46 of those who got injured had. Okay? And we see it again for sprint distance, 41 versus 55. You can read it as well as I can, and similar trends for accelerations and HMLD. So what does that mean? Well, let me put it really simply for you. It's really important to get back to the levels of running that you would do in normal training beforehand, yeah? But don't get there too quickly, yeah? Okay, so what does that really mean? What are the takeaways? Well, intensity appears to be more important than volume. Okay, your intensity seems to be more important with volume, but that makes sense. It fits with what we know around tapering methodology. We've done this with training for many years. If you're tapering for an Olympic Games, you drop your volume, but you keep your intensity. Yeah. If I'm with muscle injury going back to sport after injury, I'm less worried about volume, but I'm really concerned about intensity. Very high speed running and sprinting. I've got to get that back in. I've got to practice that skill. I've got to build the tolerance of the individual to run fast. And I'll build the volume stuff over time. Yeah, so it fits with that. The other thing is try to get to the very high speed running levels and stay there and stabilize for a week. So actually what we did, brought in last year, was we said we want to add an extra week where you stabilize at your very high speed running volume. So it's not like I need to get to here, and once I got there, then everything's good. I've got to get there and stay there for a week, and then I go back to play. And guess what? Our rate of re-injury has dropped significantly. Okay, so now that's a hard sell for some coaches. We need to take one more week of him running fast. But actually, when we start to show the data, if you take this 1 week now, could be worth 5 weeks later. Yeah, we'll build more robust players. Show the data, have the conversation. Okay, and that it's more than just having the ability. I've hit this speed in this session, therefore I'm fit to return to play. We can do better than that, surely. Yeah, but here's the other thing. It's not all about sprinting. And Eamon's here. He's going to be speaking later. He's one of the authors on this paper. One of our physios at Leinster, which is one of the provinces, as part of his PhD, did a video analysis study of looking at the injury mechanisms. And what we did is then looked at here's 17 hamstring injuries. 1 was direct contact, and 16 were non-contact. And in this paper, Fergal Kieran describes 5 distinct actions: running, deceleration, kicking, the tackle, and rucking. And so rucking is where there are at least 2 people competing for a ball that's on the ground with the player. Okay, so they're competing against each other. It's hard to describe that, so I'll leave it at that. Okay, but what we saw with that in terms of all of the video analysis, in terms of the mechanism, is that all non-contact injuries involve trunk flexion and an extending knee. So there was trunk flexion and an extending knee in all non-contact injuries. And for all running injuries, you had trunk flexion and rotation on an extending knee. Okay, so all of a sudden we now have to not just pay attention to strength or pay attention to sprinting, but we're now paying attention to what's going on with the trunk and the hip. Yeah, intuitively it makes sense, doesn't it? And so what does that look like? Well, I'll show you. This is a player. Hopefully it'll play. Keep your eye on this guy here. Okay, this is us in the World Cup just before starting the last World Cup and one of our first training sessions. Not a good day at the office. Really important player. Yeah, there he is doing his hamstring. Look, you can see how he's stepping. Look, extended his knee. There, look, extended knee, trunk flexion, rotation. See the mechanism? Yeah? Can you see how he goes in that? And he describes that moment. So in this position here, he's there. Can you see? Trunk flexion, rotation, extending knee. That's the moment. You go, that's great. That's rugby, Phil. You carry a ball. I'm not interested in rugby. I want to think about soccer. Well, I'm glad you asked. So here we go. There you go. It can happen in soccer as well. And when you start paying attention and looking for this, guess what you start to see? I would say you'll see this way more often than you think. So quite often you'll see, and often where it's something to do with the other, with an opposition, or the ball doesn't quite go where you thought it was going to go, or it landed. I'll go back there again. This is, will it play? Yeah. Okay, so can you see how he gets a nudge? Can you see the trunk flexion? He rotates and his knee's extending. And so we see it in rugby. Here's an example in soccer. There it is again. Yeah, trunk flexion, rotation, extending knee. And here it is in Aussie rules. Just look at this guy. Here's a still from the video. You can see how he's on an extending knee and his trunk is extending. Yeah. So that might be something to pay attention to, as well as just Nordic hamstring curls. Yeah, and so let's train that. So here's some of the stuff that we have in our robustness program. This is one of our strength conditioning coaches who used to be a rugby player. You can probably tell, but we're looking at this hip hinge pattern. Are we getting good hip hinge? Are we getting lengthening? Then double leg into single leg, adding some speed, increasing load and speed, as say now, adding a rotational component. So we're getting hip hinge, trunk flexion, rotation, eccentric bias on an extended knee. Then we're coming up into a dependent stance where we're looking at that rapid sort of forward leg biased Romanian deadlift. Then adding in, that is the player that you just saw a moment ago, into that sort of positioning, hitting into that hip extension pattern. Yeah. Adding some resistance then into this, as you can see. And so we're starting to think of trunk flexion. And then also we're looking at trunk rotation through multiple planes. Again, getting trunk rotation, extension, trunk rotation, trunk flexion on an extended knee. So we're building that capacity across each of those systems. So we're starting to build, if you like, that picture of what it is that we want to try to do something. And this guy, he loves his kettlebells. I think he takes them to bed. Yeah, he carries one around like a baby most days. I do give him abuse on that. Okay, so and then we're able to provide, if you like, our player fingerprint. So where are they? Where are their risks and rewards? What's their sprint exposures been? How strong are they? What's their trunk flexion rotation? What's their strength and so on? And so that helps us have these 5 pillars, if you like, of our hamstring management. Good trunk control, neuromuscular control, the ability to respond to that external perturbation, the high-speed running or very high-speed running, building force velocity capability, and eccentric strength. And in doing that, we can look at each of these things, okay? Having good strength and range through that trunk, good neuromuscular control with those unpredictable variations and being able to react. Very high speed running, regular exposures, hitting those critical velocities regularly. Those force velocity capabilities, J.B. Moran's work, I'm sure you're familiar with, but doing targeted intervention for those who need to develop strength and those who need to develop a velocity capacity. And also still working on our eccentric strength, but not a single muscle. So how we put that all together. So it's very important to have good technical skills, clearly. You need to tackle well, you need to pass a ball well. We've set our standards, which we talked about, and then we have these pillars. We train these all the time. Everyone knows that they've got to do it, and they're getting trained every week. And guess what happens whenever you get injured? You still train them. You just train them in the context of rehab. Those are still the pillars of our rehab, or the pillars of our training. And actually, as you're able throughout the journey of rehab back to return to sport, as soon as you're able to go back into the normal training with the rest of the squad, you do with that component until ultimately all of those things are being trained and you're back reaching these standards with the rest of the team. Okay? So that rehab then isn't this thing that's separate to, but that rehab is actually training in the presence of injury. And then if we think about robustness, it's not this thing you do, it's the whole program. Robustness is the program. It's not Nordic hamstring curls. It's not doing some sprints. It's everything. Yeah. And if you want to build robust players, think about the program, not just your golden bullet or silver bullet, golden bullet, silver bullet exercise. They don't exist. And anyone who tries to sell you them, they're just trying to make money or a name. Yeah. And so remember also for that return to performance component, it's a process and not just an event. So that when, to me, it matters less. It'll matter a lot to the coach and to the player, but it matters less to me when the player returns to actually play a game, because it's not just about the game. It's about everything. It's about the ability to do all the training, to play, and to turn up consistently. I mentioned that player. He could play tomorrow, but he'd probably be injured within the next 3 weeks. Yeah. So for him, it's going to be much more of a process. For someone else, it might have been appropriate for them to play tomorrow. Yeah, you get that? So I've said this many times, I'll say it again. Then that's why I believe that rehab is training in the presence of injury. We apply the same principles that we apply in all of training. We understand the mechanisms, and hopefully this builds more robust players. So my time is gone. Do I have time just to show this video, or shall I stop? No. I'm in Switzerland, timing's important. So, so this is rehab of our player at the World Cup. You can see how we were applying some of these. Here's the trunk flexion, rotation, adding some unpredictable stuff that he's less comfortable with, adding in trunk rotation, getting a little bit of work working through those multi-planar whole body patterns. Getting out on the field, this scares most people when they look at it. It certainly scared the player, but this is what he's going to have to do. Remember, this was the player we just saw a moment ago. So getting him into this position where he is in trunk flexion rotation with an external focus where the ball wasn't sure where the ball's going to. And I know that if some people end up in that position, if you can cope with that, you're doing pretty well. Yeah. But if the first time you've been exposed to that position is in the heat of battle on a pitch when someone's trying to hit you really hard, then maybe we haven't prepared them very well. Yeah. And so, key takeaways then. Remember, robustness is the program. Think more than just a single muscle or one exposure to sprinting. Think of the big picture. Mm-hmm. Remember that return to performance and return to play is a process, not just an event. Think of the whole big thing. Mm-hmm. Think about integrating it across the system so the things you do in training reflect the things you do in rehab and vice versa. And consistency is everything. Climb high, sleep low. thank you so much. I have to acknowledge these people for their assistance in preparing all of this, and it's been super to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Is there any question from the participants somewhere? There's somebody.
Hi. How do you score and prevent overtraining?
It's a really good question. So what we look at very closely, so I think GPS is one component, and the thing about GPS is that because it's easy to measure, everyone depends entirely on GPS often. And I think it's very helpful, but it can't be the only thing. But certainly we track all running meters at all speeds that people will do over time. So we'll track that very closely and look for spikes or in that training, so ensure that the volume isn't there. But in addition to that, and I think almost more importantly, we do regular monitoring through the week. And I think most importantly, and it's so easy to lose sight of it within so much data, is we've got to talk to our athletes. And we've got to ask things like their rate of perceived exertion, how fresh they feel, their readiness to compete. I think paying real attention to that. Then we look at other range of motion measures like sit and reach, knee to wall. We'll look at sleep quality. We'll look at appetite. We look at their mood state, their freshness. We say, how fresh do you feel? And so when we do all of these monitoring sessions every day, during the week, and we're looking at our training loads and our gym loads, or we measure that using push in terms of the metrics, the tonnage that they'll use. And then putting that all together as a team, we sit together and look at all of that, and we'll say, do we feel this person is redlining, are they there, or do we need to change and modify? So we pay really close attention. So that's a lot, and I appreciate that's not possible for everyone. So the number one thing, talk to our athletes. How fresh do you feel? What was the rate of perceived exertion with that? What's the quality of sleep, quality of nutrition? Get those things. I think those are the key pillars for us.
Is there another question? Then we have one from Slido.
One from Slido. I will put two in one. So, does imaging has its place for criteria for returning to sport? And what do you mean if they're injured? Do you rely on pain or structural damage?
Okay, so the role of imaging, and we know there's a lot of research. Arnold has done some great work, as have many others, to say that MRI scans are not great in helping predict return to play times. Okay, and that so what I would say is then in terms of determining return to play, I would rely on the clinical criteria and progression. Much like what Lynn has just described, time and clinical presentation is really important. There is a biological limit to healing. Okay. Now, where scanning can help will help inform us around certain subtypes of injury. So where there has been, if we're using the British Athletics muscle injury classification system, where there's a C-type injury, which is where there's involvement of the intramuscular tendon. So if we'll use scanning to determine, is there intramuscular tendon involvement? What we tend to do is take that a little bit slower because tendon heals differently to muscle. Yeah. If there is a T-junction injury within our distal biceps femoris, we know they tend to have this thing in the T-junction where they can almost unzip, or if we push them too hard too soon. And I can think of how many of those I missed in the past, many years ago, before knowing that it even existed. And so where imaging will help us inform where there is a particular type of injury, intramuscular tendon or T-junction, we will tend to move a little bit slower and treat them more like a tendon injury rather than a muscle. But the grade of the injury and the muscle doesn't really change things. I absolutely will rely on the clinical presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's time for the first break. Ich wechsle auf Deutsch und auf Französisch, oder ich versuche es. Wir machen... Oh, danke. Wir sehen uns wieder um 11:10 Uhr hier wieder zurück. On fait une pause jusqu'à 11h10. Merci.
Bravo. Bravo.